Hello and welcome to the European Report. Here we are once again in the European Parliament in the heart of Europe here in Brussels. In today's topic we're going to be discussing the alarming rise of anti-Semitism. There's been three separate reports this month. Firstly, the French security forces that look after the protection of the Jewish community have reported there's been a 58% increase in anti-Semitic instances in France. There's been a 30% increase in anti-Semitic instances in Belgium, and Britain has reported the third highest rate of anti-Semitism for 2012 on record. The other issue we're going to be discussing as well today is the issue of Hezbollah and why hasn't the EU classified Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation. And the final issue we'll be discussing today is the issue of funding to the Palestinian Authority, and is European taxpayers' money really going to help promote peace in the Middle East? And today I'm joined by Tomas Sandell, the Executive Director of European Coalition for Israel, Charles Tannock, MEP, who's a Conservative MEP, and Daniel Schwammenthal from the Director of the Transatlantic Institute. So, gentlemen, welcome to the programme today. Thomas, it's good to have you back on the European Report for this programme. Can you just share with our viewers some of the work you've been doing and some of the initiatives you've been involved in recently?
Well, as you remember, last time we met, we were just in the process of organising the Holocaust Remembrance Day event here in the European Parliament, and there has been a lot of follow-up from that event. This time we had actually faith communities commemorating the victims of the Holocaust all over the world. And only to take an example of Japan, apparently we had some 100 different events in Japan where people were for the first time paying attention to what happened in Europe, and of course where also Japan played its role. In Finland in particular, but I know this is an issue which goes across all of Europe, we have a movement aiming at boycotting goods produced in the disputed territories. And this is something that we are engaging in, just trying to look at some of the legal arguments which are being used, and but in particular asking the question, because this is being driven by Christian development NGOs, asking the question to say, well, is Israel really the greatest human rights threat in the Middle East when we look at the situation in Syria and all across that region? And this is, as you can understand, keeping us very, very busy. And we'll continue this debate throughout the year, and it will not only be limited to Finland, it will be in the UK and many other countries which are very active on this front.
Excellent, that's really good work. And Charles Tannock, MEP, it's an honour and a privilege to have such a, I would say, a statesman who's really stood up for Israel and the Jewish people here in the European Parliament. Can you share something about your very distinguished political career as a member of the European Parliament?
Well, I'm beginning to blush, I think, for your viewers. I've never been called a statesman before, but just to give you an example of two recent things I've done in the last few days, literally, of interest to your viewers. Today I was involved in setting up the founder meeting of an intergroup, an informal intergroup of the Parliament to combat anti-Semitism, which is an idea which I came up with John Mann last year when the Westminster, the House of Commons, all-party group came over here and we had a joint meeting. And I thought it might be worthwhile doing something similar here. And I was very pleased with the attendance. It's been chaired by my London Labour colleague, Claude Moraes, and we had representations from all the mainstream centre-right, centre-left groups. Socialists were there, the Liberals were there, my group, the ECR, BPP were represented. So I really hope that will be a very useful way of highlighting unacceptable incidents, both within the Parliament, things that are said by other members, but also events throughout the European Union which need to be identified and exposed and shamed, frankly. Another thing I've done last week, I did two parliamentary questions in rapid succession to try and revitalise the campaign which I was behind about almost a decade ago, and I have to say has not achieved the result that we'd wished for, namely to have Hezbollah proscribed as a terrorist organisation. Following the atrocities in Bulgaria, when the Bulgarian government identified a link to Hezbollah in Varna, I thought it was timely to try and remind the Council of Ministers of the fact that at the moment they maintain this ludicrous fiction that the political or civilian wing is somehow different from the military wing and from the terrorist activities of Hezbollah. So one is allowed to operate in the European Union and the other isn't. But in practice, Hezbollah itself makes no distinction. And at the highest levels of Hezbollah, it's one joint command structure. So I did one on the issue of banning Hezbollah, particularly banning the so-called civilian or political wing. And the other was also on the interdiction of the funding, because for as long as one part of Hezbollah can act, they can still raise substantial amounts of money in the European Union, in the mosques, and through various Islamic charities and what have you, and front companies, and possibly even links to organized crime or whatever. But they have ways of raising considerable sums of money, and there was an intervention by an Israeli minister recently saying that if that could be interdicted and prevented, that would cause serious damage to the organization. So something I've championed. I did have some success, as I said, almost a decade ago, on getting Al-Manar television taken off air in terms of being allowed to transmit its terrible programs to our viewers in Europe, you know, inciting anti-Semitism, violence, terrorist activities, and so on. So I think it's timely now to try and reinvigorate the anti-Hezbollah campaign. We were successful with Hamas, and I really think that Hezbollah is in exactly the same ballpark as Hamas. Clearly, the French and others are very sensitive about the fact that if the European Union did ban Hezbollah, that it would have an impact on the stability of Lebanon. That remains to be seen. Obviously, there's always a difficult calculus here. But nevertheless, you know, it's very, very clear that Hezbollah, as a proxy for Iran, are also supporting the Assad regime, perpetrating terrible atrocities on civilians in Syria as we speak. There's evidence that Hezbollah have got armed militants actually operating side by side with the Alawite Syrian hardline regiments of the Ba'athist regime in Syria. So there is a risk of obviously problems in Lebanon, but nevertheless, we have to call a terrorist organization what it is, a terrorist organization. It should not be allowed to raise funding to effectively carry out atrocities anywhere in the world, but least of all in the European Union on our own territory.
Oh, absolutely, and you're the perfect guest for this programme today. But I just want to thank you so much for the stance that you make, and I think many of our viewers should be aware of some of the great work being done here in the European Parliament on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people, which brings me in nicely to Daniel. Daniel, it's great to have you on the programme today. How did you get involved in international relations, and can you tell us something about the work of the Transatlantic Institute?
Right. I was always interested in international relations, which is why I started my career as a journalist. And before I joined the AJC Transatlantic Institute, I was an editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal Europe, based here in Brussels and in Amsterdam. And it gave me a lot of opportunity to write about the sorts of issues that we are dealing with also here today on this program. But I realized over the last 2 years of my employment that I really wanted to focus on the Middle East and was looking for an opportunity to do that, and which is why I joined the Transatlantic Institute. And it is our view that, first of all, the name Transatlantic Institute is not just a coincidence. We strongly believe that a strong transatlantic relationship is absolutely important for all the work that we want to achieve, be it countering terrorism, which is a global threat, a threat against the Western world, be it fighting for pluralism and human rights, and also finding, you know, peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and particularly more stability in the region. And so some of the programs we are doing here, for instance, we had a couple of months ago, we had Matthew Levitt from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's probably the expert on Hezbollah in the academic think tank world. We had a number of meetings with him at the European External Action Service, with Belgian Foreign Ministry officials, with the EU anti-terrorist official, and also a public event. So this is something that we've been working on. We had an interesting event just last month with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which is linked, of course, to the EPP, on anti-Semitism in the Arab world, and how that affects peace or the lack of peace between Israelis and the Arab world. So these are some of the examples of our work in the past few weeks.
Excellent. It sounds like very, very good work. The first issue we're going to discuss today is the issue of anti-Semitism, particularly as we've seen that recent statistics for 2012 have seen sharp levels of anti-Semitism. Charles, I've got a few figures here, and these are the reports that have come out this month. That in France, according to the SPJC, which provides security for the Jewish community, they've reported that in France, anti-Semitic incidents have increased by 58% in 2012. Belgium's seen an increase in 30% in anti-Semitism. And also Britain has had its third highest record of anti-Semitism for 2012. What do you make of these statistics?
Well, they're very worrying, disturbing, and very frightening for the communities who are on the receiving end of these threats to their security. I remember, again, I've been around a long time. I've been in this parliament now since 1999, but I remember about, again, I think 11 or so years ago, there was a report done by one of the EU devolved agencies, then it was called the Agency in Vienna for, I think it was racism, xenophobia, I think it was then called. And they had a report on anti-Semitism, which they then tried to bury, and they didn't want to publish it. And one or two of us at the time who were active on issues to do with the funding of the Palestinian Authority, who also had concerns about anti-Semitism, insisted it did come out. And that was the beginning of a rise that they were beginning to detect. It was buried because, and I don't know how to put this, but because it wasn't necessarily always the sort of usual suspects of far-right sort of, neo-fascist or Nazi, neo-Nazi groups or whatever. Sometimes it was within second and third generation immigrant groups from the Maghreb. And that was obviously a delicate issue and had to be handled. But I don't think you could have buried the facts. You have to know where the problem is and how you can combat it and how you can try and, as it were, bring education to bear and bring influence to bear. And we saw the terrible murder in France only last year of, by that fellow whose name, I can't even remember his name though, but it's probably an infamous name one doesn't want to remember. Again, I think he was second generation Algerian French who murdered a child, in cold blood. I mean, absolutely horrendous stuff. So this is a real problem, and it's a delicate problem. We're all aware of it. I do not accept that the Middle East conflict between Israel and the Arab world can ever be used to legitimize or excuse any kind of behavior between a diaspora community from the Arab world living in our countries as an excuse to attack European Jewish citizens. That's unacceptable. And I think every politician, rightly and roundly, even those who were no friends of Israel, condemned it. So I think that is quite heartening in a way. And I hope that child and the adult who were killed last year, their lives won't be lost in vain. I hope something can be done in France. It's clearly a problem in France. It's clearly a problem also in Belgium, but this problem's been around for about a decade, because I remember 10 years ago these incidents were being reported, particularly in Belgium, particularly in Antwerp, and also in France. So we've seen an escalation over the years. People need to have some innovative thinking on how we can try and address this issue, and maybe we need to have people going into the schools. In the areas where there are large numbers of individuals of North African origin, and say, and teach about the danger of racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism. We need to think of where they're getting this propaganda from, where's the brainwashing coming from. These are just some suggestions, but if I had an easy answer, the problem would have gone away. And it's 10 years on, I'm having the same conversation as I'm having a decade ago, which is very, very worrying.
It's very worrying. And Thomas, what do you think are these underlying causes for what we're seeing as an alarming increase in anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic attacks, and yet at the same time there's greater Holocaust education and awareness?
Well, again, I agree with Charles. If I had the easy answer, I would probably be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by now, and I wouldn't be sitting here. Yeah. But seriously, I always said this on the program, and I believe it's important to stress it. Anti-Semitism seems to come in all shapes and forms. And I believe, in particular, as we are a Christian organization, it's perhaps more fitting and appropriate to look in the problems in the Christian circles. And we know, of course, that the problems in the 1930s were not coming from a Muslim communities. They came from a very civilized European culture, which many people would call Christian. So I believe what we take as an honor as a Christian organization is to look and in our own circles and see, well, are these same ideas floating around here as well as they are in other pockets of society? Just to give some rather alarming examples, I come from Finland, as you know, and we have one of the smallest Jewish communities in Europe. Nevertheless, what we see right now is new expressions of anti-Semitism, things which we have never seen in Finland. Remember, Finland is a small country, it's a stable society. We haven't been hit by the financial crisis in the same way as Hungary or Bulgaria or Greece. I think in the cases of Greece, which is mentioned often, or Hungary, where a member of parliament is suggesting that they should try to start identifying Jews again, mark the Jews. You can perhaps look at it and say, well, when we have a deep financial crisis, this is something which happened in the 1930s, it's happening again. We're looking for the scapegoats, and for some reasons the Jews tend to be very good scapegoats in this European climate. But nevertheless, my point is to say that if we look at the other end, stable society with no real financial problems, still will see these new, rise of even old anti-Semitism. There is a case now with the Finnish state prosecutor when they are looking at a free handout magazine which is being distributed by a supermarket chain, where you can read about the same theories that the Nazis had in the 1930s. And this is being circulated in supermarket newspapers. So, and this is in my country. So I guess what I'm saying is that the question is complex, the problems go very deep.
And there are different origins, as you say, in countries like Hungary, where Jobbik and the extreme right, it's very much a resuscitation of the 1930s type of virulent, extreme nationalism, xenophobia, and racism. In other countries like France and Belgium, it's a different phenomenon, which seems to have some cross relationship with the excuse of what's happening in the Middle East. And so it is a complex phenomenon, and it needs to be looked at from different angles. But as was pointed out, and as you pointed out, we've tried very hard just education and awareness. Perhaps we need to be more proactive now and actually send people into the schools and talk to the kids, really.
Yeah, I think that's the way forward. And Daniel, what was your impression of these reports? And do you believe that leaders of the European Commission is fully aware of these figures? And secondly, do you believe that our leaders within the European member states are actually dealing with this issue rigorously enough?
Well, I surely hope that people in Europe and in Brussels and around the continent are aware of these figures. They are absolutely horrendous, and it's quite interesting. If you look a little bit deeper into the data of the French report, which was actually done in coordination with the Interior Ministry, and it's the Interior Ministry figures that recorded something like 175 hate crimes in France last year, out of which 96 were anti-Semitic in nature. So that also puts the whole thing into perspective. It's not just a phenomenon that anti-Semitic attacks increase. They are completely out of proportion to a community of 500,000 within a population of
less than 1% of the population.
Yes, yeah. and they also identified only 9 anti-Islamic attacks. Now, every single xenophobic attack is one too many, but again, this puts it into perspective. This fear of naming many of the culprits in Western Europe of anti-Semitic attacks unfortunately come from within the Islamic immigrant community. And there's a sort of fear understandable fear that by being too loud about it, one might stoke xenophobia vis-a-vis this community. Most of the people, of course, are completely innocent of these crimes. But it shows that this fear is perhaps a little bit overblown with only 9 of these attacks, and even though there are, something like 4 or 5 million people in the Muslim community, I think without, as Charles said, without really being honest about the problem, I mean, the first order is to identify the problem. Otherwise, we won't be able to solve it. And if we try to sweep it underneath the carpet, we will definitely not be able to tackle this problem. We need to be honest about it. And as Charles said, this sort of excuses that it is linked to the Arab-Israeli conflict is first of all unacceptable. We wouldn't accept it the other way around. If suddenly there were Jews around beating up Arabs, and the excuse, well, it's the Arab-Israeli conflict, nobody would accept this, and certainly nobody in the Jewish community would accept this. But it's also ahistorical. Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, in the Arab-Muslim world, is not a result of the Israeli-Arab conflict. It's one of its causes. If we look back at history, particularly the history of the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Palestinian leader during the 30s, who was a Hitler collaborator who spent the war years in Germany, in Berlin, as Hitler's guest. We have, unfortunately, what started back then, a very, very odd mixture of combining certain elements of anti-Jewish thought that existed in the Islamic world mixed with European 20th century genocidal anti-Semitism. And this is the brew, so to speak, that the Mufti helped to create, and we are still suffering under these from these results, as this has become really the trademark of radical Islamists throughout the world, and jihadi phenomenon, whatever, however you want to categorize it. And so we have to stand up and clearly name the culprits and speak up against. That's the very basis of any sort of policy.
And support the moderate Muslim leadership who are condemning it, because sometimes they have to be very brave, because some of these radical extremist jihadi groups are extremely unpleasant and aggressive, and they also bully and put enormous pressure on these moderates. And we need to put all our weight behind the moderate voices, the reformists, the voices of common sense and moderation, who are, the imams will stand up and say, no, this sort of language is unacceptable. And that's what we need to do.
Absolutely. Many more Muslims die from Muslim terrorism, from jihadi terrorism, than non-Muslims. So if we don't stand up and provide this sort of security and forum for the people within the community to speak up, then they will be all alone and will not be able to confront this threat.
And Thomas, following this line of argument we have here, do you think that one of the key issues of why we're seeing an increase in anti-Semitism is because it's easy to recognise the former Nazi-style far-right anti-Semitism, because Europe, we saw the devastating consequences of that during World War II, in which over 6 million precious Jewish lives lost their lives at the hands of the Nazis in the Holocaust. But this new form of anti-Semitism that's coming in from immigrants from the Arab world and from North Africa has a whole load of complex issues attached to it, and fear and political correctness is one that's enabling us not to actually tackle this subject.
I agree with everything that Charles and Daniel have been saying so far. I would like to add one more element. I've sometimes called it sophisticated anti-Semitism, because it doesn't come in the usual, neo-Nazi or Islamist shape and forms, but it comes through the most sophisticated elements in our Western societies. You may call it liberal, you may call it left. It could be anywhere. Just to give you an example, I think most people have heard about the city of Malmö in Sweden by now, where in 2009 the mayor of Malmö could not guarantee the safety of the Israeli tennis team to play a Davis Cup match in Malmö. Which is very odd. Again, I mean, the Israelis, they play all over the world, but in Sweden, in this Scandinavian idyll of safety and brotherhood, they couldn't guarantee the safety of an Israeli tennis team. He then went on record to say that Well, he said two things. He said, well, the Jewish community in Malmö would do themselves a lot of good if they would distance themselves from the policies of the Israeli government, which was odd in itself. Then he went on to say, because people then said, well, isn't that a strong statement? Are you a bit racist? And he said, no, I'm not racist at all. Anti-Semitism is just as much not tolerable in Malmö as is Zionism. So there you put anti-Semitism and Zionism on the same level, in the same category. And the mayor of Malmö is a very popular leader, and he's a social democrat. And still to this day, he cannot understand why he has been blamed for being anti-Semitic. This is what I call the sophisticated sort of anti-Semitism, where you still don't get it because you say, no, how can I be an anti-Semite? I hate Hitler just as much as anyone else. Whereas you still use his arguments, and you put Israel as a democratic state on the same equal footing as racism and anti-Semitism. And this is something which you see increasingly in Europe, I would say, where you just take away the word Jew, because of course you can't say, Jew is bad or Jewish, but you say Zionist. So once you've used the word Zionist or Zionism, you think you have cleared your back, and you come back to this issue of what is legitimate criticism of Israel and where do we cross the line of coming into anti-Semitism. And I know I was at the same meeting as Charles earlier today, and I believe this is one of the issues that you probably will have to face. Where do you draw the line? Is it acceptable just to say that Zionism equals with anti-Semitism? I wouldn't think so.
To me, that's not acceptable at all. No, that's not acceptable at all. Zionism is the right for a Jewish state, as far as I can see it. It's the right to establish the homeland for the Jewish people. Right. I mean, obviously, there may be some Zionists who are extremists in the way they wanted to set about that, and I would condemn that if they use violence against innocent people. But Zionism as a concept is building a homeland for the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is about condemning you for your birth or your religion or your ethnicity.
Right.
That's the way I distinguish about it. I mean, that's not a very sophisticated analysis, but that will be a working definition as far as I'm concerned.
Perhaps I could add one question, one element to the case of Malmö, because also what you hear, and I heard it in Sweden, I was there a few weeks ago, you then hear and say, well, why is it that we are talking so much about Malmö? And you then hear it from the most highest political level to just a man on the street that you happen to talk with, and he said, well, it's the Jewish conspiracy. It's these Jewish, very powerful networks around the world who have brought this against Malmö, who has brought it against the mayor of Malmö. And I think this is a new, it's not new because we heard it in the 1930s again about the Jews who are controlling everything in society. But the fact that you hear it said and stated in Europe today in 2013, for me is quite scary.
And Daniel, I just want to bring you on board on this one. How does the Jewish community here feel in Belgium about what is now a 30% increase in anti-Semitic instances here in Belgium?
Look, I mean, they are of course concerned and worried. There have been a number of, luckily, no murders in recent years, but there were, school children who have been beaten up here in Belgium, or bullied simply for being Jewish or being, seen as representatives of the State of Israel. And it's a terrible situation. No police can 100% protect you from these sorts of situations, and it has caused some people to consider immigration even to Israel and other places. So it's a real concern for, if you put yourself in the position of parents who have to send their children to schools where the schools can in some cases no longer guarantee the children's safety or normal upbringing.
And Charles, it's very important that there are MEPs like yourself who are making this stand against anti-Semitism. How can, say, the general public get behind politicians like you who are doing very good work and courageous work on this issue?
Well, I think they just need, do unto others as you'd have done unto yourself. How would they feel if they were members of a peaceful, hard-working community and targeted purely because they were that particular distinction and domination rather than another one? I mean, it's barbaric, and you have to appeal to people's common sense and people's sense of humanity. I mean, clearly there has been you would have thought that the European public would have learnt their lessons from the horrors of the Second World War. And I think, a post-war generation set about constructing the European project for all its good things and bad things, partly never to go back to the horrors of what we saw in the 1930s. But, 3 generations on, and people are forgetting about those horrors and are playing with fire because, European societies are very complex constructions now, multicultural and diverse, and it would be devastating if the sort of evil rise of nationalism and xenophobia were to really infect our cities. The consequences aren't worth thinking about. So I think hopefully most people will come to their senses. We talked about, earlier on I was talking about the Italian elections with another news program, and fortunately the protest vote seems to have gone to a comedian. I think we can live with a comedian, although I'm very worried about the economics of what it means for the Italian fiscal program. But it'd be much more worrying, of course, if you see a rise in parties of the extreme right, extreme nationalism, with extremely xenophobic agendas. We've seen a little bit of that, as I said, in Hungary with Jobbik. In Britain, I have to say I'm reassured by the fact that the BNP vote has actually collapsed in the last few years. We had 2 BNP MEPs elected 4 years ago, and it's highly unlikely that they will be re-elected. But it would appear that vote has now shifted to UKIP, which clearly is not. I'm not remotely saying that UKIP is a BNP look-alike, but we have to watch very, very carefully. I mean, UKIP had some sort of Palestinian group which they set up, which made some rather, I think, unacceptable comments the other day. So there's a danger of these sort of broader coalitions on the hard right encompassing people with some really quite extreme views as well. So I think, one of the purposes of the all-party political group which set up today is to monitor events and to inform the political class and the general public and to condemn. There's obviously always a fine line, but there is always a border, which mustn't be crossed between freedom of speech and incitement to racial hatred and violence.
Absolutely.
And that's a clear division in my mind.
And the other issue we're going to discuss is an issue that's being discussed here in the European Parliament, and this is the issue: should the European Union classify Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation? Charles, I'm going to come back to you on this one because I know that you've done a lot of work on this issue. Firstly, why this has come to the light primarily because of the terrorist attack we saw in Bulgaria last year, in which 5 Israeli tourists were killed, including a Bulgarian bus driver, and the Bulgarian government has pointed and given strong evidence that Hezbollah was behind this attack. And yet the EU still has not classified Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation and wants to separate the political wing from the military wing. Can you tell us why the EU wants to keep this in place and why they haven't labelled or classified Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation?
The EU ultimately is the lowest common denominator of the views of all the member states. Within the EU there are countries like the Czech Republic, like the United Kingdom, who I think would support banning the entire Hezbollah organisation. There are other countries like France, with its historical connections to Lebanon and to Syria, who have been extremely reluctant because they take the view that because Hezbollah is a very large, well-organised political movement within Lebanon, was in coalition with the government, has a large presence in the parliament, is extremely well armed and so on, and well organised, that would make it impossible to have meaningful dialogue with Hezbollah as an interlocutor in Lebanon. So, I mean, I can see their arguments from the Middle East political perspective up to a point, But ultimately, any organization which is carrying out terrorist activities anywhere in the world, and particularly on the territory of any member state, including Bulgaria, as far as I'm concerned, should be called what it is, a terrorist organization. And we shouldn't be allowing 1 cent or one UK penny of our monies from our continent to end up in the hands of people who wish to perpetrate atrocities on innocent civilians.
Yeah. And Daniel, can I want to bring you very much involved in this one? Can you tell us something about the about Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation known in Arabic as the Party of God? But why does Hezbollah pose such a threat to the security of Europe and the destabilisation of the Middle East?
Look, Hezbollah has been called the A-team of international terrorism. It is the group that actually introduced the phenomenon of suicide bombings into the Middle East when it bombed the American embassy in Beirut and American and French peacekeepers. So for the Europeans, in this case French, 52 or so brave French soldiers were among Hezbollah's first victims. So this is not a new phenomenon. It is, of course, also particularly dangerous because it is closely linked with Iran. Iran has basically created Hezbollah. It's funding it. And it's a proxy, really. It's fully integrated into the military Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and is therefore an arm also for Iran to carry out international terrorism, and as we now seeing, is increasingly involved in helping President Assad butchering his own people. And the argument that putting Hezbollah on a terrorist would destabilize Lebanon is laughable. It is, the most destabilizing factor for Lebanon and the entire region. It is now starting a war with a second neighboring country. Not only has it been attacking Israel for many, many years, it is now directly involved in this civil war in Lebanon, and which has invited retaliation from Syrian rebels into Lebanon proper. So there is no doubt in my mind that it's not only morally the right thing, it's also, in terms of realpolitik, the only proper course of action.
Yeah. And Thomas, I just want to give you a quote from Israel's ambassador to the UN, Ron Prosser, on this one. He says he has slated European countries who classify Hezbollah as a charity, and this is what he said. He said, not since Napoleon invaded Russia has the European continent seen such an astonishing lack of foresight. He went on to say that calling Hezbollah a charity is like calling Al-Qaeda an urban planning organisation because it desires to level tall buildings. Now, why?
That's Ron at his best, because he used to be ambassador in London. He had a sort of a sense of humour the way he put his message across.
But really, doesn't he really explain the lack of moral clarity in confronting the danger and threat posed by Hezbollah if they're operating here in Europe?
I think there are a number of issues which are very problematic for me. One is the fact that you make a distinction between Israelis and Europeans. So the red line seems to be to say that, the minute a European will be killed on European soil, it's a major problem. But if the case is that there are Israelis, we can still sort of tolerate it almost. If I'm not completely mistaken, I think there are parallels even going back to the 1970s. And we don't often think about the fact that the PLO at the time, and we're looking at 1972 and the massacre in Munich, could operate fairly freely in Europe, even at that time. And I think there are strong evidence to point in the direction that there are certain intelligence services that would look the other way. And I take Italy as an example in the 1970s, I think, because we have the strongest evidence right there, where from Italian intelligence sources, they would basically say, well, don't mess with Italian targets, Italian citizens, and we'll look the other way. That is, of course, not to say that they were proactively supporting or openly supporting terrorists, but it's a dirty deal. And I believe from you can basically say that there are a number of countries that take this this line to say, well, as long as you don't touch our targets, we can look the other way and we can make a deal. And I believe this is something where we would have to hear a very clear political message from this parliament and from national parliaments and from governments to say that we cannot make a distinction between citizens, non-European and European citizens, and we need to call a spade a spade. I don't think there should be a long academic discussion as to whether Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. As Daniel said, it's the A-team of terrorism. And it's long overdue that Europe would say this clearly, and I wish, of course, that there would be many more like Charles in our parliaments who would have the spine to say this.
Absolutely. And Charles, you have to leave us very shortly, but can I just give you one last question before you go? And this is regarding the British government's position. I've classified Hezbollah into the political wing of Hezbollah, which is seen as legitimate, and the military wing, which is not. Surely the British government need more clarity and need to follow Israel's line, the United States' line, also that of the Dutch, in classifying Hezbollah as an international terrorist organisation that poses a threat not only to Israel, but also to the stability in the Middle East and the security of Western Europe.
Well, I mean, I can't speak for the British government. Even if it is a Conservative-led government, I don't get consultant on these matters, which would hardly surprise you. I do remember about 6 or 7 years ago raising this with Jack Straw when he was the Foreign Secretary from the Labour administration. He said, oh, well, you know, if you've got evidence to show that money has reached, you know, a terrorist from Hezbollah set up in the UK, we'd be interested to hear about it. You know, but I could see that he really didn't want to get involved with this issue. I would hope now that there has been a bit of a wake-up call. I think there is certainly an appreciation in the British government, and in fairness, at the end of the previous Blair government, that Iran posed the most serious global security threat in terms of their quest for nuclear weapons, and clearly an existential threat to the state of Israel. And that, you know, even if you are drawing a totally unacceptable distinction between, you know, EU citizens and other citizens and who are the targets of their attacks, the fact of the matter is everybody now knows that Hezbollah in the Middle East is basically a department of the Ministry of Defense or the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in what's happening in Syria. So, you know, irrespective of the issue that they are terrorists and should be identified as terrorists, they're also the allies of a country which poses a threat to global peace, let alone Middle East peace, you know, in terms of an arms race and all the rest of it. So there's every reason, there's absolutely no reason, in my view, from our own foreign policy and security and human rights concerns to allow them to operate with impunity within our own jurisdictions. So, you know, no to Hezbollah, and I've been saying that for over a decade, and let's hope that 2013 is the year in which they are finally banned.
Let's hope so. And Charles, I just want to thank you so much for being our guest here on the European Report, and thank you for your courageous stance on these issues. Charles Tannock, MEP, had to leave us. He's got another meeting now, so that just leaves us to continue discussing this issue of Hezbollah. Daniel, I want to bring you into this one. Surely Europe is out of line. I mean, we've had the US Secretary of State, Kerry, has really outlined that Europe is out of line, is what he said in terms of this position. How important is it for Europe's moral authority and standing in the world that they take this issue of classifying Hezbollah as a terrorist organization seriously?
Look, it's absolutely crucial. I would say that not listing Hezbollah is the dereliction of duty. It's a failure to protect its own citizens and a failure to protect those who wish to visit Europe. That is absolutely unacceptable. Europe, the European Union, derives a lot of its soft power, and it's quite proud about it and quite open about it from the perception that this is a community of law and a community that respects human rights and democracy. It is absolutely incompatible with this sort of claim of moral authority, of being a community of law, that an organization, a terror organization, would be allowed to raise money in Europe, to raise funds, to recruit new members, and even plot terror attacks. In addition, this is not just any terrorist organization. It's an organization that has a vile, genocidal, anti-Semitic ideology at its core. So I think it's an incredible stain on Europe, and one it needs to remove immediately.
And also going on this issue, I mean, there's been a recent article in the New York Times in which a security source has been quoted as saying that Hezbollah has been very active here in Europe, identifying Jewish and Israeli targets for attacks. Surely by allowing the political wing of Hezbollah to continue to finance, train and assist the overall program of Hezbollah, this also doesn't only endanger Israelis and Jewish lives, but also that of ordinary Europeans.
Look, money is fungible. The idea that, Hezbollah, the political arm, the so-called welfare arm, can be separated from its so-called military arm is, as Charles and Thomas said, laughable. Hezbollah itself openly says that no such distinction exists. And of course, it is quite plausible that they are plotting new terrorist attacks right as we speak here against potential Israeli targets, against European Jewish targets, or any sort of Western European target. And we should not, get into this game of allowing to distinguish between various sorts of potential victims. We know that they are not only targeting Israelis. Already at this terror attack in Bulgaria, they didn't care whether also the Bulgarian bus driver or any other non-Jewish Israelis will die. And we know that they have targeted Jewish targets in the past, such as the attack in the 1990s in Buenos Aires, where they bombed a Jewish community center with more than 80 people. They killed more than 80 people. So these warnings need to be taken very, very seriously, and Europe needs to act now.
Yeah. And Thomas, I mean, so many people, maybe the European Commission, are not fully aware of the extreme religious and political ideology of Hezbollah. For example, they call for genocide against the Jewish people, and it was only a few years ago that the leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, said that he wants to see all the Jewish people return to the land of Israel, because he said if that happens, then it's easier to annihilate the Jewish people worldwide. And surely that is comparable to that of Hitler and the Nazis.
I think the problem, as we said so many times in this parliament, is the political correctness of not wanting to discuss certain issues. And being fearful that somehow you will be misrepresented, you stay away from the sensitive issues. And I believe this is one as such. I mean, as soon as you go and make comparison to what actually was said in the 1930s and 1940s and show it with hard facts, with evidence to say, well, listen, this was being said yesterday on this TV channel, or this was being repeated in that mosque, or on television in a particular country, people simply don't want to listen. And I'm not sure what it will take in Europe for people really to get the simple message, to listen, to read. And most of the cases, of course, things are being translated. So of course, you may not know all these exotic languages, because mostly it's not said in English. And that's part of the problem as well. There seems to be a double talk where you say certain things in English, and this is what we quote and what we rely on. But it's not difficult today to have things translated. And I think we should, as citizens of the European Union, we should make this requirement both to our members here in the European Parliament, but also to the officials of the European Commission, that they would actually read and comment on what is being said.
And a final issue for today's programme, we're discussing the final issue, that is, are European taxpayers' money that's going to the Palestinian Authority being well spent, and is it fostering an atmosphere for peace? I very much want to bring you on this one, on Daniel. I mean, according to my figures here, that the British government pays somewhere around £70 million to the Palestinian Authority, and the European Union gives something like a ridiculous sum, 500 million euros, in which 2.5% of the Palestinian Authority's monthly budget goes to the salaries for Palestinian terrorists in Israeli prisons. Is the money that the EU is giving to the Palestinian authorities being used to promote peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Look, there is no clear-cut answer to this question. A lot has improved over the past few years thanks to Prime Minister Fayyad, who has done a great job in tackling for the very first time, really, Palestinian corruption, mismanagement, and this sort of thing. But as you have just cited, there are still a lot of mischief, if you want to call it that, being done with money, and I have even read that this money that goes to Palestinian prisoners, and we have to be a little bit more precise. The money doesn't go to just any prisoner; it goes only to Palestinian security prisoners. In other words, Palestinians who have been accused or charged with the under the terror laws, and it goes. And the higher your punishment is, in other words, the more serious your crime, the more money you get. So, in other words, they are subsidizing Palestinian murderous terrorism with EU money, and that clearly has to stop. And that is clearly something where the EU must come in and say, we will simply cut off those 6.5% or whatever it is of the budget. At the very least, that's what they should be doing, and say you need to stop that. There is absolutely no justification for encouraging this, terrorism in this form.
And Thomas, I think thanks to organisations like Palestinian Media Watch and Memory, we've become very much aware of how EU money, and certainly EU taxpayers' money, is being spent in terms of the Palestinian Authority's education system and also its media, in which incitement and hatred against Israel and the Jewish people exists. How will that foster steps towards peace in the future when a whole generation are being brainwashed into essentially thinking of genocide?
Well, I think there are two issues at least, and I think this is probably where I would, for the first time, disagree slightly with my friend Daniel. I tend to be more pessimistic when it comes to the management of EU funding by the Palestinian authorities. And if the reports which we hear from Israel, and they are, well, not only from Israel, but from the Palestinian side, if they are true, there seems to be a huge mismanagement and nepotism from the Palestinian leadership's side. And it's interesting because I almost feel a bit guilty pointing this out, and I did it I think it was last month. I saw one of the most prominent members of this parliament, and I mentioned to him, because I just been speaking with someone who had the hard facts, and he looked at me and he was upset. He said, well, why do you always have to go after these guys? You know, this is the only thing we have, and these are the best people we have right now. Are you telling me that they are corrupt? And I said, sorry, don't shoot the messenger. If this is the truth, I think it's the first people to have it investigated should be those who are putting up the 500 million of our money in this European Parliament. Let's hope that this is not the case, but evidence seems to be pointing in this direction. To give you a little bit more of a daily example, last time I was in Jerusalem, I had an Arab Palestinian taxi driver. He heard I was from Europe, and he said, well, we are the craziest people on earth. And I said, why do you say that? He said, well, because you are funding the most corrupt leadership we ever had. And I said, well, this is interesting. Well, why are you not, making a fuss about it? Why don't you go to your leaders and point this out? And he said, well, are you crazy? Do you think I want a hole in my head? And so he sent a very strong message back to Europe and back to me as a, politically active and a taxpayer. We need to make these leaders even more accountable. And I would say, as we did some 10 years ago when Charles was active on this issue, if it can be proven that the money is wisely spent, there is not mismanagement to the point that we are claiming it is, go ahead and increase with 10%. But also, then I come to the second point, if you can make a clear if you can explain clearly that this is really contributing to peace, and then we come to the content side and say, well, if we are putting all this money on the table, we have to look into the curricula in the schools, what is being taught, so that we are investing into peace and not into more antagonism and more provocations.
And Daniel, we've got about a minute and a half left of the programme. I just want to say, if you've got a final comment on this one, how can the EU tighten up and monitor where the money's being spent so it's not used for funding of hate, and it's not being used or channeled into terrorism activities?
Look, we can have a discussion of whether the glass is half full or half empty. No doubt there is still a lot to be done for the Palestinian Authority to improve things, but I think there is clearly, particularly when one compares it with the leadership under Yasser Arafat and now with Salam Fayyad in control, there has been a great improvement, but they still have a long way to go. I think they have the tools to really look into what the Palestinian Authority is doing and funding, and I think this is the sort of more for more and less for less is, in essence, a new European policy, a new European neighborhood policy that the EU has declared that it wants to implement, not just when it comes to the Palestinians, but generally with particularly the Arab world, in order to foster real democracy, real pluralism, and they need to apply it very strictly also with the Palestinian Authority.
Gentlemen, I just want to thank you for both of you joining me on the European Report today. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And I want to thank you all for watching today's European Report. As you've seen in this programme, we've seen an alarming increase in reports of anti-Semitism across Europe, and this is important that Europe has that moral calibre to actually confront the growing awareness of and danger that's posed by anti-Semitism. And also, Europe's moral credibility is under threat by not classifying Hezbollah as an international terrorist organisation and making a separation between the political and the military wing of this dangerous and deadly terrorist organisation. So thank you for watching today's programme.